Okay, so we're meeting today to talk about Nancy Chodorow's paper that was in the 2026 Psychoanalytic Quarterly second issue that came out this year. And this is actually a pretty special occasion because this was Nancy's last paper. And she reached out to the quarterly and when she was sick and told us that this paper was in the works and was hoping that we would publish it. And we really were anticipating that this was going to be sort of a collaboration where we would go back and forth with drafts and think about her paper together. But unfortunately, she was too sick to do that. So we had to sort of take her paper as is and share it with you and sort of have it be a work in progress that was very much on her mind and important to her when she died. Her paper is titled Freud in His Psychosocial Generation, Durkheim, Simmel, Weber, and Du Bois. And in the issue of Psychoanalytic Quarterly, we were fortunate to have responses by both Dr. Seligman and Dr. Prager. Now, in our talk today, I'm going to refer to Dr. Nancy Chodorow as Nancy, and the reason for that is not out of disrespect. It's because each of us had a personal connection with her, and I think we feel close to her each in our own way, and calling her Nancy feels closer to how we would talk to her or I think about her because we all knew her and cared about her. So I'm going to introduce our participants today, and the first person I'm going to introduce is Nancy. And Nancy Chodorow was a training and supervising analyst at the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, a lecturer in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and a professor emerita of sociology at University of California, Berkeley. She was a renowned feminist scholar. Her work focused on gender, sexuality, the American independent tradition, comparative theory, and psychoanalysis and social science. She was a prolific author of many articles and books, including The Reproduction of Mothering and Individualizing Gender and Sexuality. She passed away in 2025 at the age of 81. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Patricia Harney. Pat is a psychologist, psychoanalyst in Cambridge. In addition to her independent practice, she is the director of the Psychology Internship Training Program at Cambridge Health Alliance, where Nancy was a longtime faculty member, and an assistant professor of psychology and psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Her writing on trauma, gender, and loss has appeared in scholarly and general audience publications, and she has a forthcoming book on traumatic grief with Columbia University Press. And then I would also like to introduce Dr. Stephen Seligman. Steve is a clinical professor, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco, and also at the NYU postdoctoral program in psychoanalysis. He is a training and consulting analyst at the San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis. He's an author and published Relationships and Development, Infancy, Intersubjectivity, and Attachment, a book that I've read and love. And that book has been translated into a lot of languages: Italian, Spanish, Chinese, Korean, and even Ukrainian. He's the co-editor of the Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Core Concepts in Clinical Practice and the editor-in-chief emeritus of Psychoanalytic Dialogues. Dr. Seligman is author of over 100 articles, chapters, and reviews, many of which take up the intersection of infancy, the infantile, and psychoanalytic theory and practice. So that's a chance to introduce each of you. So I thought we would start our conversation today just by speaking about how we knew Nancy. And I think we all feel connected to her work, but as I said, we each felt connected to her as a person. And I'll just begin by saying Nancy was one of my faculty members when I was a psychology intern at Cambridge Hospital. And then I was fortunate to have her be my mentor when I was an APSA fellow. And during that year, Nancy said, well, what do you want to do together? And I said, well, I don't really want career advice. What I want is to think with you. And so every month we would meet once a month and we would read articles together. And we read Lowald, did close readings of Lowald and and Choctaw. And each month we would kind of delight together in these authors, and it was my first experience reading them, and it just was a kind of a life-changing experience for me, and I still hold those papers so close to my heart in my work and in my thinking. Okay. Pat, can you say a little how you knew Nancy?
Sure. Like you, I met Nancy in person through our work together at Cambridge Health Alliance. Nancy joined the faculty there in 2006, so I realize I've now known her for 20 years. And she was a colleague. I also participated at the beginning of her writing group that she ran for faculty members at the hospital. And then she taught my interns, which Johanna, you were one. Um, and then just through that colleagueship, we became friends. So she is certainly a very dear person to me. But when I met her in 2006, she was very known to me and had already had an impact on my life. I first learned about her work when I was in college, a senior in college, and what she wrote about in terms of, well, the reproduction of mothering really mapped onto something I was so eager to learn more about, thinking about development and the unconscious. I was in a developmental psychology program, student of Gary Grothenbrenner's, where we looked a lot at various contextual factors on development, but we always left out the unconscious, the individual psyche. And so here was work that was not only looking at that, developing mind and how the inner workings of the mind are influenced by the social world, but that she was particularly interested in gender. And then when I went to graduate school, I was in a graduate program where we had very good, dynamically oriented, analytically oriented clinical training and very dry, traditional academic psychology research. We read very little psychoanalytic theory in that program. And so the first psychoanalytic book that I read as a graduate student was Feminism and Psychoanalytic Theory, that came out in 1989. So when I met her in 2006, it was like, meeting a goddess in the pantheon. But she was such a grounded person. It's still difficult to think of her. Still think of her in the present tense. She was a goddess with her feet on the ground. And then over time, we knew each other as mothers. She knew my children. I knew her children. Sadly, met her grandchildren only after she passed. We had mutual, as I'm sure you both did, mutual loves of music and art. She was just such a full person. I love that this paper is published as a lecture because we really get to hear her voice.
Thank you.
Well, this is sad. Yeah, I missed Nancy. I didn't see her that much. I live in San Francisco, and in the early 2000s, I guess she moved back to Cambridge. I first knew her in Cambridge. I was a senior in college, and I was writing I wasn't sure what to write my undergraduate thesis on, and her boyfriend at the time said I should talk to her. I was trying to decide between writing about Jean-Luc Godard and something having to do with psychoanalysis and sociology and structural functional theory and Marxism, and which is the space Nancy was in very much. And he said, you ought to talk to Nancy. And I met her at their house, but I never really followed up. And once I wrote what I wrote, I wrote about structural function. I wrote about sociology and psychoanalytic sociology. And, then the Reproduction of Mothering came out, and I thought, man, that was a mistake. And, I'll just say that, I think maybe not everyone here is old enough or into Nancy's world enough to know that her book, The Reproduction of Mothering, was one of the most important scholarly works in second wave feminist theory, and is almost uniquely sophisticated in its account and integration of gender theory and sociological theory and psychoanalysis. And she draws both on ego psychology and object relations, psychology, psychoanalysis, and developmental psychoanalysis. And it's really an amazing application of all of those. And she kept writing in that vein, in a personal way, in different ways, you know, and really also she was true. She was when she was in college, she was an anthropology major, and she was always fond of anthropology, and she really had an anthropological perspective on everything, including on psychoanalysis itself. So one other anecdote, we were involved in a committee to reform the curriculum. This is a small thing, but it mattered to me. The curriculum of our institute, San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis. And I was kind of going crazy about a certain plotting in indirect perspective that characterized our discussions. And I said this to Nancy, and she said, "Look, you don't understand. This is the culture." And I think I understood subsequently that that was the culture. And I think she saw things like that a lot of the time. And we had the same Volvo repairman in Cambridge, and we were in a writing group together, and when she lived here, and just a great person to be around, as well as it's so unprepossessing, but such a brilliant contributor. And this paper was presented. The last time she presented a paper was when she presented this paper at the San Francisco Center, and I was lucky to be a discussant. And some of my comments are appreciative, but some were critical. And she was totally into it, and as an academic, she was just so fine in that way. And the last thing I want to say, I know I'm going on a lot, but I appreciate the chance, was that there are a lot of academics who write about analysis, but they either don't know analysis in general. They know the big three writers or something, Freud, Lacan, and Laplanche or something, which is great. But Nancy was an analyst and a practicing analyst. And she knew the whole analysis literature. And so she's special. She was and is special in that regard, and her work lives on.
Thank you. So now we're going to move into sort of thinking about this paper. And again, it's called Freud and His Psychosocial Generation, Durkheim, Simmel, Weber, and Du Bois. Pat, would you tell us a little bit about the paper?
Sure. I'll just give a little bit of a summary of what I think are three main points and some ideas about where her thinking might point us going forward. As we've already talked about, from the beginning of Nancy's career, she's explored the questions of the relation between the psyche and the social and the psyche. And in this paper, it seems to me she does with Freud and the foundational sociologist she names what she always aims to do, which is to situate the individual, in this case Freud, within a social group, and in this case within this generational cohort of founding theorists, Durkheim, Weber, Simmel, and Du Bois. And she argues that these theorists represent the foundational members of a generation that created psychosocial theory, all born between the years of 1856 and 1864. So essentially, she wanted to place Freud in a group. But of course, she's not placing Freud in just any group of cohort members. She's specifically looking at these individuals because in one way or another, she argues they all explore a central question. How do we put psyche and social together? How do psyche and social give meaning to each other? And this paper outlines several themes that partly define the large body of her work. In an early paper, she tells us that she coined the phrase relational individualism. And she's looking at the questions, how is our individuality structured socially? How are we separate and connected at the same time? We know Reproduction of Mothering was in part an exploration about how this varies by gender, whether we're daughters or sons, how mothering replicates this social structure. And in this spirit of separateness and connectedness, she explores how separate and connected these theorists are in relation to each other. She looks for evidence about whether they and to what extent they may have read each other's work, or even to what extent they knew of each other, and or how they may have been connected even if they didn't know each other. She says we can find something of these writers in each other, even if they weren't necessarily aware of it. And so, as Stephen has told us, Nancy was first a psychological anthropologist and then a sociologist and psychoanalyst. So she looks to what these men may have experienced in the zeitgeist as a part of their common experience. She wants to look at the common perspective that they all may have in common. And from there, she looks to the experience of otherness, the experience of anti-Semitism and racism in the zeitgeist in Middle Europe and in the United States at the time. And true to Nancy's, what I think is her eternally curious manner, she reflects on how her own thinking and theorizing has been constrained by society as well. And so a part of this paper is an exploration of her own. We can feel her enthusiasm in learning more about Du Bois's writing, and how that was very much related to her own participation in the Holmes Commission, the Racial Task Force. And I just thought that this was a particularly vivid quote that I'll share, where she says, "I would say only that there must have been something in the intellectual cultural zeitgeist and something in their experience of marginality. The Europeans, with the exception of German Protestant Weber, Jewish Durkheim from a lineage of rabbis, Du Bois as an American Black. Both men had a view from within and from without, the underpinnings of a double consciousness." And she reminds us that double consciousness describes splitting and projective identification as both psychic and psychosocial experiences. I particularly enjoyed her comment that for her, there can never be too much social in the psyche and too much psyche in the social. It's sort of up to us to play with what that might mean and what that could look like, I think. And just thinking about the ongoing challenges that we have today, it remains a large project to continue to consider how to bring the social into the psychoanalytic, to think about how the social order gets internalized within the individual and what explains the variations in that internalization and its resistances. We can think about our current cultural and social context as pointing to the desperate need really to think about these issues. And I'm very aware of what happened today with the stripping of temporary protective status to Haitians and Syrians. And I think the Durkheim quote that Nancy uses in this paper is also so potent today, where she, quoting him, says, "When a society undergoes suffering, it feels the need to find someone whom it can hold responsible for its sickness, on whom it can avenge its misfortunes, and those against whom public opinion already discriminates are naturally designated for this role." I think there's just no end to the work that we need to do in thinking about the questions that have been so characteristic of her work throughout her life.
Steve, maybe you could.
Okay. Yeah. So I've been asked, which I appreciate a lot, the chance to comment on Nancy's paper. And I think, Patricia, thank you for setting me up in this position.
My pleasure.
And Jen, thanks for asking me. Actually, I have a couple of things I want to say about the paper per se, but I found myself, Johanna said, well, you could read the papers and you should read Nancy's paper and maybe read our discussions. But I want to quickly review what Patricia alluded to. Okay, great, Pat, Steve, that Pat alluded to about the interpenetrating of the social and the personal and the developmental. And I wanted to I want to use what Pat articulated about locating people in relation to groups, and say something later about the relationship between Nancy's work and some of the contemporary works in the current outpouring of socially oriented psychoanalysis. So, and then I'll make a couple of questioning points about Nancy's paper. So the great opening in Nancy's work, as we've been saying, is the reproduction of mothering, where she poses. I'll read from my paper, in which I'd say the reproduction of mothering was a breakthrough integration of psychoanalysis and structural functional theory. Structural functional theory being a branch of sociology that describes different levels of the social system and how they carry out functions, each one in tandem with the other. And their structures kind of correspond at different levels, like families, schools, cities, groups, states, babies, and they kind of work together. She integrated those, and she took up the question of how is the social order internalized in the development of individual personality, which is getting even more attention today. She was a prophet. And she shows how processes usually addressed by analysis, like identification, defense, psychic structure, development, function also to serve broad economic and social purposes. Here, oh, sorry. Eek. Oh, I see. Here, organizing the motivations and activity of women to care for children. That's the reproduction of mothering. And in this way, each generation replaces itself. Societies, thinking Marxist-wise, societies have two broad functions, production and reproduction. And Nancy wrote an account of reproduction of the social order itself. And as Pat said, the nuclear family becomes looked at as the reproducer of gender relations and as being reproduced by gender relations. Now, that's a really big deal, and it opens the door to a different way of thinking about personality development. So Nancy showed how traditional gender roles emerge from the first years of life to an even greater extent than the Oedipus complex. That's a very striking breakthrough in analytic theory. Winnicott anticipates it, but Nancy applies it to a psychoanalytic sociological perspective, and she's got specific ideas about identification and gender identification. And it's also, in my understanding, speaking as a man, it's my understanding that that's a profoundly feminist move. The Oedipus complex is, in a way, it's kind of sexist. It's the father that really matters. And the dark continent of women, well, that's what happens before age 3 or 4. Well, Nancy says no. Gender gets established in processes early on. She didn't call it this, but flipping, I will say that she might have called what she describes a masculinity complex. Noting that the pressure, that boys feel pressure to disidentify with their mothers to buttress their own different agenda of having a different gender. And there were a few other people who were writing about this around the same time, notably Irene Fast and Ralph Greenson wrote an interesting article in this area. And the French feminists had a more murky and beautiful way of talking about it. But Nancy really laid it out. Now, this means that from her point of view, and other, Michelle Rosaldo, whom she wrote with, that masculine identity has a discontinuity in it. And that men, again, a little essentialist, but I don't think too much, men are alienated from themselves in a certain way. And I think in second wave feminism, and today, that remains an important observation. And I would, as a man, think, yeah, And so, speaking about men, we get the idea that there's a kind of hardening attendant to a defensive and often rigid break with that first and most tender tie to the mother. Now, but according to this, maybe it's an overstatement, but I think it's a pretty valuable account of how society shapes personality because of its needs and its structures. The heterosexual nuclear family, I get that's the story here, that that the girl doesn't have to make that kind of switch to become the biological girl doesn't have to make that kind of switch to become a gendered girl, woman. And so that's an account of gender. I'll say something about how that account of genderizing is complexified today, but that account of gender also is an account of how society reproduces the crucial functioning of childcare and reproduces it in a form which reproduces the traditional mid-century, early 20th century nuclear family. The woman is the mother, and the father is the breadwinner. Now, and of course, it's worth saying with regard to Nancy's interest in this paper, that one of the sympathetic critiques of Freud is that he was describing an arrangement which was emerging and was particular to his time. The nuclear family emerges as the key unit of the economy in the second half of the 20th century in Europe and the United States, maybe a little earlier in England, probably not. And Freud is remarking on that in his theory. And we may need a different theory now. We may or we may not. But anyway, so what is special about that? What's special about that is that she takes the idea of internalization as a psychoanalytic idea and a sociological idea and articulates it in psychoanalytic sociological terms. And she says, as Pat said, this is unconscious. She says unconscious dynamics like identification, disavowal, gender identification, which Freud describes as essentially private sorts of things, have to be understood in the public social sphere. And in turn, as Pat said, the social sphere has to be understood as operating within personality, and she maps that. And this is a remarkable thing. And people took it up before, they take it up later, but I think this is an extremely sophisticated account. Now, when two things about that. The first is that it may be, and that certainly in certain circles, we're witnessing a practical challenge to this account in its most vocal form or visible form in regard to queer theory and now to trans and gender critique and gender theory, which is, hey, no, not. It's a pretty fluid field. And I would be interested in Nancy if she would dare to make and venture to make a comment on that. But I think just to say that moves us in the direction of maybe that's an outcome of the feminist move, to the second wave feminist move, to critique and disperse these roles. So we have a different cultural ambiance, and we have a different personality structure, and we see intergenerational tension as we see the social arrangements changing and identities changing. That is, families are different. Even heterosexual straight families, many women are working outside the home, the roles are dispersing and so on. Then you're going to get a different internalization in the next generation. That's very important. And last, this is very important for analytic technique, because these things have to be addressed, or ought to be addressed, in analytic technique. Development is not just a private thing, and neither is the development of psychopathology. There are problems of adaptation and match and things fitting together in the structures. So this is a very important implication. Now, I find there's a lot of it's really great how much social psychoanalysis is being written today. I think that some of the accounts of the integration of society and social forces and so on, and the individual could benefit from the kind of fine-grained application of analytic concepts and developmental concepts that Nancy used throughout her work, and really broke through with in Reproduction of Mothering. And I think some of the stuff I read, I think, well, the group identified, or there's an identification with the culture, or we have a lot of use of the Althusserian term interpolation. And I think those are very important things. And interpolation, I don't want to go into it, is the real thing. But it's not the whole story. There are ways that social structures in their routine functioning from one level of the culture to the next, like the family, in between the outside world and the economy and the baby, bring in through daily life, as if it's the air we breathe, the conventions and structures of the culture. And those things can be described in specific ways in specific groups. And I think it really helps. And I think it helps theorize, and it helps analytic work. So it's happening a lot, but I think we could see even more of that. We need more people to do what
Steve,
Nancy did.
could you say a little bit about how the contemporary era, this generation, would utilize some of Nancy's approach, this fine-grained approach in developing their work? Like, what do you mean by that when you say?
Well, I think, for example, I mean, maybe people are doing it or they're setting up that, but I think that for example, I think it's happening, but I think that here's a question that I think is just maybe it's being discussed. My friends are going to really be on me for this, but I think here's a question: what are the give me a minute to think about this. You know, what kinds of disavowals and discontinuities are involved in investing oneself in a group, investing whether it's MAGA or being a rich white guy or whatnot. What are the what are the rules from the point of view of psychoanalysis, telling us the structure of rules is in object relations and defenses? Let's look at situations and ask that question, and and I think there could be more of that. I guess that's one kind of answer. It's a little diffuse, I guess, and a lot of people are doing that sort of thing. But I think so. I think another way that it's been of interest to me, but is how do we have these things in our analytic societies? I just bring that in because it's a good example in looking at ourselves. What are the hierarchies that we buy into? Where do we use idealization? Where do we disavow ourselves to belong to the group? How does hierarchy reproduce itself? And I think that's the thing. So I'll give you one more example. When I've discussed this with certain colleagues, I've become very interested in the specifics of development. And I think some of my colleagues tend to have a more generic approach. They say, well, that's I forget the word, but that's one guy I remember once said, so you mean comportment? And referring to, I think, a kind of Heideggerian, something contemporary term. It's not just comportment. We need to unpack that and say, what's going on in the family? What is, who does the baby identify with? Who does the 8-year-old identify with? And so on and so on. And I think that's done. And maybe I'm just being a cranky old guy, but I think those are some of the things I have in mind. I hope that's a fair answer.
And to sort of throw in more of that sort of conversation about there's so much we could be learning there's so much that we are learning or will be poised to learn about development, these sort of central concepts, identification, among families in which gender is more optional. More and more parents are not assigning gender to their babies and letting their children choose. And so how does that play out? How do we need to adapt concepts to account for those developmental trajectories? And I'm sad that that wasn't a conversation I got to have with Nancy. It would be amazing to hear how she starts thinking about that.
Yeah, yeah. So that, I mean, I think people know this, but just that's an amazing example of how projects in the large culture, developments in the large culture, things that come out of social movements and cultural movements are mediated in the family. That's I mean, in a way that's obvious, I think also, I mean, another aspect of this that is a kind of generational thing. And so gotta say, I and Nancy, I have to say, being roughly of the same generation, I'm just a little younger than she. We really came up in the ego psychology, developmental ego psychology tradition. And so we spoke this language, or I speak this language, I think she did, but that I think in a way, I'm lamenting the passing of that language, and which is a language, a fairly detailed, somewhat obsessional language about the borders, which attended in adaptationist but interesting ways to the border between character and the social. And although it blurred those at times, and it got too much forgetting about strife between culture and the body, I think there's a lot to learn from it. That's another level of what I think. I hope I've been kind of clear in terms of this. Yeah. Okay.
I think you've given us a beautifully lucid description of her analysis.
Yeah. So I'm interested in different levels of systems, and of course that was her bread and butter in the early structural functional work. Now, so if I may, I'll just try to finish with a couple of points. One thing I wanted to say, we were talking about this before quickly, I think, is that I thought, and Pat was saying this, and Johanna was saying this too, that I think she's a little bit, Nancy in this paper overstates Freud's social roots. He's a lot less social than all the other writers. And I think he really fell in. I mean, he was about something coming into the body from each individual, which is then influenced by the social, but he doesn't have any kind of detailed account of social process. And some of his accounts of social process are caricatured and also are really just translations of his individual theory, notably the Oedipus complex, into the social world. He does that in Civilization and the Discontents, in the Theory of the Primal Horde. He does it in group psychology, in the analysis of the ego, about the mob. He does it in The Future of an Illusion. Everything is kind of the Oedipus complex writ large. And I think that that's not really sociology. So he was a social guy, and he had implications to social theory. And last, small bone to pick, there's a certain point in this paper where Nancy says she talks about the American intersubjectivists. And she lists a group of writers whom I think were less intersubjectivist than the relationalist writers and the intersubjective self-psychologists who were writing at the time. Stephen Mitchell and Lou Aaron and Robert Stolorow and Jody Davies and Jessica Benjamin, of course, Adrian Harris, many, many. And I think these writers are more fully in the social world than the people that Nancy cites, who find clinicians and clinical writers that they were. So I'll stop here. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I thought we could discuss just a few other ideas that have generated from this conversation and these papers. One thing that really struck me was Nancy's joy in discovering Du Bois. I think there's something really, like, it really speaks to who she was as a person, that she went back and revisited the things she thought she already knew in the light of discovering new voices that she says she was embarrassed not to have known about. But I think that really speaks to Nancy as a person, that she could go back, and there's like a humility in it, that she's this scholar and could find this work and start thinking, how can this apply? How can he be part of this generation and be influencing things? I feel like that was, to me, was something really exciting in this paper, and it would have been. I wish she had had the chance to go on to sort of write more about Fanon and others, and how that expanded upon those ideas that she was starting to outline. But I wondered your thoughts on that.
Well, I would agree. I thought it was a beautiful kind of, she's a role model of intellectual humility, um, a true seeker, and made me very curious myself to read more of Du Bois. And I even found a recording of his voice on Smithsonian Folkways website, has him reading aloud.
Wow,
So
you should put in a link, Joanna.
I will.
Yeah.
I will.
It'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one other thing, I mean, it speaks to the issue of racism. I mean, so here's Nancy. She went to college at Harvard. I went to college at Harvard. She majored in social relations or whatever. I was in social studies. We never read Du Bois. If I heard of him, it was just some esoteric figure. He could have been some, I don't know what, he was a professor there. That, and, he's in these departments. And he's
Mm-hmm.
an amazing guy, amazing writer, and maybe it was not only as being black, but as being a communist. But wow, you know,
Yeah.
and
I was
stuff.
also struck by how his dissertation was so groundbreaking, maybe didn't have the reach at the time, but an incredible piece of
Yeah,
scholarship. Just like
yeah,
Nancy's book, Reproduction of Mothering, came from her dissertation. I'll
yeah.
never forget the look on graduate student faces when they realized that that was her dissertation.
Right,
um,
right,
yeah, and absolutely speaks to the racism. That's
right.
we have to keep that
There
addressing.
seemed to be in her paper a sort of call for people to go back and understand the ways that psychoanalysis has been pointing to the social. And even if we disagree about the ways it did it early on, she seemed to have a kind of passion for that. Like, remember, like, there's threads of thinking about the social that have always been there. And maybe those can be clues about going forward. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think sometimes when we're in a new social movement, we can kind of sort of think of the past just as antiquated. And I think she was sort of calling people to say, don't forget to read what's already there and what was the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
There's clues for how to shape this future study of the present day era.
Mm-hmm.
well, it goes to something quite complicated in the history of analysis, I think, and including and in some way, especially in Freud, because um, I think it's right that analysis is always linked up with the social and usually a little bit explicitly. But clinical practice ends up excluding the social most of the time,
Mm-hmm.
and for both because of its structure and because of the focus of the theory on the interior.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think, not only, but especially in the US, uh, in the mid century, 20th century, edging out, and still that the ego psychology tradition that I was longing for kind of clipped out the social and became a kind of adjustment oriented
Mm-hmm.
um, normative project and normativizing project. And, that we sort of did ourselves in. And Freud, it seems like, was read some of his anxiety about unbridled social forces, at least many people read him this way. He read the unbridled social forces into the individual models, of destruction and unbridled sexuality. And so it's a kind of even there, it's a kind of liberal individualization, as you said. So what a very complicated account of the costs and benefits of social life in a certain direction. And now that's under stress. And it's under stress in various ways in the whole culture, left and right and center.
Well, I think we're going to have to start wrapping up this conversation. It's been really interesting to talk with you. And I actually, throughout it, I could kind of hear Nancy chiming in. She had such a way of entering a conversation. I don't know if the two of you felt that as well.
Oh, yeah.
I would have loved to hear her thoughts, and I can just imagine her actually enjoying hearing both of you. But if either of you have any final things you want to say, I invite you.
I just want to thank you both. It's really been a lovely conversation, and really enjoyed listening to your account, Steve. And Johanna, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and for inviting us.
Definitely. Thank you. Yeah, I second that emotion. Yeah, good.
Great. Well, thank you both.
Thank you both. Thank you, Nancy.